The table looked beautiful that Christmas morning. I had set it myself, the way I always did. The good china, the red cloth napkins folded into little fans, the way my mother taught me. The poinsettia centerpiece I'd driven 40 minutes to pick up from the nursery in Savannah. Everything just right. Everything the way it had always been, because some things in this life you hold on to, not because they matter to the world, but because they matter to you. My daughter and her husband arrived around noon. I heard the car in the driveway before I saw it. That big black SUV they'd gotten the year before. The one my daughter had called me about, excited, telling me the monthly payment like I was supposed to be impressed. I remembered standing at my kitchen sink, looking out at my backyard, thinking about the numbers quietly. I didn't say anything. I never said anything. They came through the front door without knocking. They hadn't knocked in years. My son-in-law had his phone out before he even said hello. He gave me a side hug, the kind where your body barely touches the other person, and then he drifted toward the living room couch. My daughter kissed my cheek and said the house smelled good. And then she was also on her phone, sitting at my kitchen table while I stood at the stove. I am 69 years old. I spent 31 years as a high school English teacher in Savannah, Georgia. I raised my daughter alone after her father left when she was 4. I bought this house with my own money, fixed the roof twice, replaced the water heater, planted the camellias along the back fence because I wanted something living to look at in February when everything else felt grey. I did all of that by myself, and I was proud of that. I still am. But that Christmas, something felt different, not dramatic, not like a storm coming in, more like when a room is just slightly too quiet and you can't figure out why until you realize the refrigerator has stopped humming and you hadn't noticed it until it stopped. I brought the food to the table. Honey glazed ham, sweet potato casserole, green beans with almonds. The cornbread dressing my daughter had asked me to make specifically because it was her favorite since she was small. I had been cooking since 7 that morning. My feet hurt. I poured myself a glass of sweet tea and sat down. My son-in-law looked up from his phone long enough to serve himself, and I noticed he took more than half the ham slices without thinking, the way someone does when they've never had to think about whether there's enough. My daughter was telling me something about a trip they were planning to Cancun. She said it with the same casual energy you'd use to mention stopping for gas. I nodded and passed the cornbread. After dinner, my daughter helped me clear the table, which she rarely did, and I remember thinking that was nice. Then she said, "Mum, can we talk about something?" And she had that tone, the one that starts soft and gets businesslike very quickly. We sat in the living room. My son-in-law had finally put his phone down. He was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, which is the posture men use when they want to appear reasonable. My daughter said they'd been having a hard few months. I already knew some of it. She'd called me in October about credit card bills, and I had sent money then, like I had in July, and in March and the December before that. But this time she said the number out loud, and it was not like the other times. It was not a bill or a shortfall. It was a plan. They wanted me to take out a home equity line of credit on my house. She said it carefully, like she practiced. She called it leveraging an asset. She said the money would be for their debt consolidation and that they'd pay it back with a structured plan, and that my son-in-law had spoken to someone at his office, a financial guy, she said, who thought it made sense. I looked at my daughter. She was 41 years old. She was looking at the coffee table. I said, "How much are we talking about?" She said $80,000. The room was quiet. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something. I thought about the fact that I had paid off this house in 2019, 2 years ahead of schedule, because I made extra principal payments every single month for 7 years. I thought about what it felt like to hold that final statement in my hands, the one that said zero balance, and how I had stood at this same kitchen table and let myself feel that for a full minute before I went back to whatever I'd been doing. I said, "Let me think about it." My son-in-law nodded, like that was the expected answer. My daughter hugged me at the door when they left and said she loved me and that she knew it was a big ask. After the car pulled out of the driveway, I stood in my living room for a long time. The good china was still drying in the rack. The centerpiece was still on the table. Everything looked the same as it had that morning, but something had moved, the way furniture moves after an earthquake. Not far, just enough that you can tell. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the specific words my daughter had used. Leveraging an asset, structured plan, someone at his office. I thought about the fact that she had not asked me how I was doing before she asked me for the money. She had not said, "Mum, are you okay, Mum? How are you managing, Mum? Is there anything you need?" She had said the house smelt good and then waited for dinner and then asked me for $80,000. I got up at 5:30 and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the dark and did what I have always done. When something is heavy, I thought it through to the end. If I put $80,000 of debt back on this house, I would be 69 years old with a mortgage again. My pension from the school district is enough to live on. It is not enough to live on and service a new loan. If something happened to my health, and at my age, something always could, I would not be able to keep up with payments. The bank does not care that I am a good person. The bank cares about the payments. And that was just the money side. The other side was harder to look at, so I looked at it slowly. My daughter had not come to Christmas to see me. She had come to Christmas to ask me for something. She had sat at my table and eaten my food and let me pour her sweet tea, and then she had asked me to put my home at risk for debt she and her husband had accumulated by living in a way their income did not support. And her husband had leaned forward in my living room with his elbows on his knees, practiced and ready, and neither of them had seemed to consider, not even for a moment, that this might not be something I could do, or should do. They had not asked, they had presented. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. I just lay there thinking about the camellias. 2 days after Christmas, my daughter called to check in, which is what she called it. She asked if I'd had a chance to think. I said I had. She asked what I was thinking. I said I was still thinking. There was a pause and she said, "Okay, no pressure." And then she told me her husband had found a bank that did home equity lines with favorable rates and she could send me the information if I wanted. I said, "Sure, send it over." She did, within the hour. There was a link to a bank I'd never used and some notes her husband had written about terms and draw periods and interest. It was thorough. It was the most organized thing I had seen from either of them in years. And that was the moment I understood that this had not been a spontaneous Christmas conversation. This had been in progress for a while. The research was too neat. The language was too practiced. They had come to my table knowing what they were going to ask before they ever knocked on my door. I closed the email and sat with that for a day. Then I called my attorney. Her name is Wanda, and I have known her for 19 years. She handled my mother's estate and a property dispute I had with a neighbor in 2008, and she is the kind of woman who does not waste your time or sugarcoat things that need to be said plainly. I told her what had happened. I told her all of it, including the amount and the bank information, and the fact that my daughter had used the phrase leveraging an asset to describe my home. Wanda was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dorothy, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly. Is your daughter listed anywhere on your financial accounts?" I said she was. Years ago, after a surgery I'd had, I'd added her to my primary checking account as a secondary holder. For emergencies, I'd told myself, just in case something happened. Wanda said, "How much is in that account?" I told her. She said, "I think we should talk in person." I drove to her office the next morning. We sat in her conference room with the door closed, and she walked me through some things I had not thought about or had not let myself think about. She talked about elder financial abuse. She said it carefully, and she did not make it dramatic, but she said it, and I let the words land. She talked about the ways that well-intentioned family arrangements could become complicated. She asked me about my will, my power of attorney documents, my healthcare proxy. I had a will, but I'd not updated it in 11 years. Wanda said, "Let's fix that." I spent 3 hours in that office. When I left, I had a plan that was mine, built for my life and my actual situation, not for the life my daughter and her husband were imagining I had. That afternoon, I went to my bank. I sat down with the branch manager, a quiet man named Harold, who I had dealt with before, and I made some changes. I removed my daughter from my primary checking account. I opened a new savings account in my name only and transferred the bulk of my liquid savings into it. I did not do this in anger. I did it the way you do something practical, the way you change the locks after a break-in, not with fury, but with the clear understanding that something has changed and you have to account for it. On the drive home, I stopped at a red light on Abercorn Street, and I sat there and felt something I had not expected to feel. Not sadness, not victory, something quieter than both of those. Relief, maybe. The feeling of having done something that needed to be done. I did not call my daughter to tell her what I had done. I did not send an explanation or a letter or a text message with a long list of my grievances. I am 69 years old. I have learned that explanations in situations like this tend to become negotiations. And I was not interested in negotiating my financial security at this stage of my life. She called me 3 days into the new year, a regular call, asking how I was. We talked for about 12 minutes about nothing in particular. She did not mention the money. I did not mention it either. About 2 weeks later, she called again, and this time she said she wanted to follow up on the home equity conversation, and I said, I've decided not to do it. There was a silence that stretched longer than comfortable. She said, Mom, we really need this. I said, I understand that. She said, Is there anything we can do to change your mind? I said, No. She said, I don't understand why you wouldn't want to help us. I thought about that for a moment. I thought about the Christmas table, and the good china, and the cornbread dressing, and the 45 minutes I spent at the nursery choosing the right poinsettia. I thought about 31 years of teaching other people's children to love language, and the roof I fixed twice, and the camellias. I said, I do want to help you, and I have helped you many times and in many ways over many years, but I cannot put my house at risk. This is where I live. This is what I have. She was quiet. I said, I love you. That is not going to change, but this decision is not going to change either. She said okay in a tone that meant it was not okay, and we said goodbye, and I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen and looked out at the backyard. The camellias were bare in January, the way they always are, but I knew they were not dead. They were just waiting. In a few weeks they would start again, pink and full, the way they had every year since I planted them, reliable and unhurried, on their own schedule, answering to no one. I made myself a cup of coffee and I sat down at the kitchen table, my table, in my house, with my name on the deed, and I let myself be still. My daughter and I still talk. It is different now, quieter in some ways, more careful. There are things that do not get said, which is true in most families if they are honest about it, but I sleep well. I wake up in the morning and I know exactly where I stand and what I have and what I owe, and the answer to that last one is nothing. Not to the bank. Not to anyone who expects my security as the cost of their love. I told a friend about all of it a few months later, over lunch, and she asked me if I felt guilty. I thought about it genuinely, the way the question deserved. I said no. She asked me what I felt. I looked out the window of the restaurant at the street outside, at the ordinary Thursday afternoon moving past, people going to their cars, a kid on a bicycle, a woman pushing a stroller, all of it unremarkable and continuous and real. I said I felt like myself. For the first time in a long time, I felt exactly like myself. And that, I think, was the whole point. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, trying to figure out what it actually taught me. Not the lesson you'd put on a greeting card, the real one. The one that took 69 years and one Christmas dinner to finally understand completely. What happened to me didn't come out of nowhere. I raised my daughter to know that when she needed something, I would show up. And I did, every time, The rent shortfall, the car payment, the October call that I didn't ask too many questions about. I showed up because that's what I believed a good mother did. But somewhere in all that showing up, I stopped asking whether I was helping her become someone capable of standing on her own or just making it easier for her not to have to try. That's not blame. That's just the truth. And the truth is that the pattern between us had been building for a long time before that Christmas table. When my daughter sat in my living room with her husband and asked me to put $80,000 of debt back on my paid off home, she wasn't being cruel. I don't think she thought of it that way. I think she had simply learned over many years of me saying yes that my resources existed in relation to her needs. That's not a character flaw she was born with. It's a dynamic that got built, slowly, the way most things that matter get built, one small decision at a time. But here is what I also know. Understanding how something happened doesn't mean you have to let it keep happening. What I did in the days after that conversation wasn't anger, it was clarity. I sat at my kitchen table at 5:30 in the morning and I thought it through to the actual end. Not the comfortable middle where I tell myself it will probably work out, but the real end. The one where I'm 69 with a new mortgage and something goes wrong with my health, and the bank comes for the house I spent 7 years paying off early. I made myself look at that picture until I could see it clearly. That kind of thinking, honest, uncomfortable, willing to follow a situation all the way to its conclusion, that's not something that comes automatically. It's something you have to choose to do, especially when the person asking you for something is someone you love. I called Wanda because I had enough sense to know that love and good intentions are not the same as expertise. She asked me questions I hadn't asked myself. She used words I hadn't let myself use. And when I left her office, I understood something that I think a lot of people in my position never let themselves understand. Protecting yourself is not the same as abandoning someone. Those are two different things, and the world will try very hard to convince you they're the same, especially if you're a mother. The hardest part wasn't removing my daughter from the bank account. It wasn't saying no on the phone or sitting with the silence after she said, "I don't understand why you won't help us." The hardest part was deciding that I deserved to finish my life in the security I had built without apologizing for that. That took something I'm not sure I had when I was younger, the willingness to hold a boundary without needing the other person to agree that the boundary is fair. Dorothy didn't win anything that winter. There was no victory. There was just a woman sitting at her own kitchen table, in her own house, with her name on the deed, and nothing owed to anyone. The camellias outside were bare and quiet, the way they always are in January, waiting for what they already knew was coming. That kind of patience and that kind of certainty, I think that's what it actually looks like to take care of yourself.